Today I'm joined by Antony Loewenstein. I'm looking forward to having this. Get your name right. Old friend and big ball question asker. So tell me, you were born in Melbourne?
In Melbourne in 74 to what I would call liberal Jewish parents. Only child. Parents were born in Australia, but my grandparents came from Europe. They got out in 39, just before the war. Most of our family, being Jewish, were killed in the Holocaust. Sadly, very common story. And the ones who could get out came here in 39 to Melbourne. And I think in some ways that whole experience, I mean, obviously I wasn't a refugee, nor were my parents, but my grandparents were. And I think for many Jews that massively informs their view of the world and Israel. It certainly has impacted mine in different ways to many other Jews, which we can talk about. But I think when you're growing up, it's just an expectation you support Israel, because the theory being, God forbid something like that happens again, we can go to Israel. As a Jew, you're allowed to go there and claim citizenship and become an Israeli citizen if you can prove that you're Jewish. I've never done that, but you can pretty much almost automatically become Jewish. I only mention all that because I think the expectation that as a Jew you support Israel has massively impacted how I view my work now on that issue. And of course now I don't support Israel, but back in the day it was just expected that he did. So yeah, I grew up in a liberal Jewish home and went to university in Melbourne as well. So that's my background.
I love that. It's kind of a classic Jewish immigrant story done well. Well, what did your grandparents do? They were refugees.
Well, my grandfather was a tailor. He'd been a tailor in Germany. They came from Dresden, which obviously became East Germany after the war. And I never met his wife, who died just before I was born, but his second wife was essentially my grandmother. And she started like a clothing company with a great name called Snappy Panties, which is a name I think is just hilarious and funny. Doesn't exist anymore, and I think was mostly kids wear and just comfortable. I guess what you'd call these days sort of active wear, I suppose. But yeah, so my family's background was, I don't want to say working class, but they were probably doing okay back in Germany in the day, but they were not lawyers or doctors. Yeah. My father was a lawyer, but yeah, there was just a feeling, I suppose, that they wanted to give my father, because they were also an only child. He was also an only child. My mother was too. So we've been almost cursed. I've got 2 children myself, so I've broken that curse now. But in general, yeah, most of the Jewish community, I think, was understandably in trauma for decades. And still are in many ways.
I mean, you see stories like that in the Holocaust Museum, and all of their extended family would have died horribly, pretty much. You know?
What's sort of amazing is that until about 10 years ago, I became a German citizen. So I'm a dual citizen. I'm an Australian, but also German. And that was because after the war, Germany had this law that essentially said that if you were a German Jew back in the day, the Nazis said that you weren't Jewish anymore, or weren't German, which of course was not true. But they allowed you to reinstate your German citizenship after the war, almost as a way of reparations.
Absolutely.
And for decades, most Jews didn't do any of that because their view was basically fuck Germany. Simply put. And in the last 20 years, though, there's been a massive change where so many Jews have said, actually, I could become a German citizen, I could be an EU citizen. So yeah, I'm a full German citizen, which is sort of a weird feeling. I remember I went to the embassy consulate here in Sydney about 2011 and received the passport after I could prove that my bona fides. I remember I was a bit teary. I don't feel German, I don't feel European really, but there's something about historical circle being closed, sort of almost. Germany's done.
I think it's a good thing.
It is.
I don't necessarily feel English or Irish, but it's only a few generations ago.
Absolutely.
And I do claim their history of parliamentary democracy, for example.
With all its faults, but yes.
With all its faults, but back to the English Civil War, I like to think that's part of my history. It's one of the reasons I didn't have a problem joining the British Army.
Yeah.
And I think
in fact, you were able to join the British Army as well.
But I think that's great that it's a good rebellion against the idea of being Jewish. It is a citizenship. It's a religion, not shouldn't necessarily classify you. You're German, or you were Germans.
Yeah.
And it's I think that was part of the problem, the idea that you weren't Germans, or I think that possibly is part of the problem with Israel, the idea that being Jewish is a citizenship all of its own.
Well, obviously, if Israel views Judaism, although only a certain kind of Judaism, if you convert here in a non-Israeli country, in a liberal, progressive synagogue, Israel doesn't recognize you as Jewish. So there's all those issues there. But no, to me, the legacy of the Holocaust is the opposite of what Israel has become.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting what Israel is doing is like the Holocaust. I don't make that comparison.
Yeah.
But I think the oppression that Israel commits against the Palestinians is exactly the wrong lesson that I think we as Jews should be learning from the Holocaust. And Israel's increasingly proud ethno-nationalism is something that, for growing numbers, particularly young Jews, is shameful. I've spent time there. I lived there, spent time in the West Bank and Gaza, all across Israel and Palestine, and there's parts of it I love. It's a beautiful, fascinating, remarkable place. But politically, it's broken, and the West indulges that, unlike, frankly, any other country on the planet, because of arguably historical guilt.
I think directly so. Anyway, we jumped ahead. I wanted to say you grew up in like me, your father was a professional.
Lawyer, barrister.
And and I met him, charming man, and you, what did you want to be when you were 7? Did you have a different experience to me in that your grandparents, the Holocaust, that must have been relatively heavy on you, but...
They were not actual Holocaust survivors. As I said, my family was killed. They got out in 1939.
Yeah.
They, I guess, were seen as survivors of Nazism because they obviously fled, but they weren't actually in the camps, thankfully. But I thought I wanted to be a scientist when I was 7. Now I'm appallingly useless at maths and science, so that was never going to happen. Maybe when I was a teenager, because my dad was a lawyer, I thought maybe I wanted to do law. I don't know. I never got the marks, so it was a bit of a non-starter anyway. Finished school and did an arts degree, which was the perfect general degree that gave you time to work out what you wanted to do. And then I guess I fell into a group of people who were interested in politics, left-wing politics, and ended up co-editing the student newspaper at Monash University down in Melbourne. And loved writing and thought, I think maybe I'll do journalism, and went to the UK in 1998. And thought, I wrote to The Guardian and I was shocked they didn't respond, and why I didn't get a job. What absurd young naivety that was. And I worked for a few years there, nothing in journalism at all. Came back in the early 2000s and thought, I think I want to do journalism, and started writing for the local newspaper in Melbourne. Applied for cadetships at Fairfax. It was called Fairfax back then, now it's called Nine. And eventually got a job here in Sydney as a trainee at what was then called essentially Fairfax Online. I did that for 2 years, and it was an amazing experience, but I realised very quickly, it was just 2003 it started, so essentially it was the Iraq War, and I was writing lots of stuff that had nothing to do with the Iraq War or Israel-Palestine, but when I did write about those issues, I had a lot of issues with management and with the Fairfax board, who I was told were regularly getting complaints by various lobby groups about my work. It was just absurd. What I was writing was mild. It wasn't, down with Israel. It was the occupation's terrible. Maybe Palestinians are human beings. Maybe the Iraq War is wrong. And in the end, after being at Fairfax for 2 years, I left, and I've been independent journalist since 2005. And it was a great experience. I learnt lots of incredible things and met remarkable people. In some ways, a mentor of mine was a woman called Margot Kingston, who older people watching might know. She's not so much in journalism now, and her and I could not be more different. She's a very different personality to me, but I guess what she taught me was that you can be a journalist and challenge power. And although most journalists, if you ask them, say, yes, I'm keeping power accountable, it's complete bullshit. You don't benefit career-wise in general if you do that.
And when's the book come along? My Israel Question.
My Israel Question came in 2006. It was my first book, which essentially was a critical look at both Israel-Palestine and the role of the Israel lobby. And the whole response to that was insane. A year before the book came out, a then Labor politician, Michael Danby in Melbourne, who's a Jewish guy, he's not in Parliament anymore, condemned me in Parliament, said the book should be banned. It's like, the book's not written, mate. But it was amazing publicity. It was a sense somehow that I wasn't the first person being critical of Israel, of course. I wouldn't dare claim that I was, but there was a sense, I think, for a lot of people that I was youngish at the time. I guess I was, roughly in my late 20s, early 30s. And the experience of many people in the Jewish community was you don't speak critically of Israel, not too critically, because somehow Israel is so weak it can't handle it, which is absurd. And the Israel lobby was very effective at keeping people in line. And I just thought that was bullshit because I'd been over there, I'd seen what was happening, and was being done in my name. So the book came out in 2006 and there was, attempts to try to ban it. The lobby groups were pressuring my publisher. I was being condemned in Parliament. I mean, in hindsight, it seems so insane. And wonderfully, the book became a bestseller because of that.
Yeah.
So
like
all that,
Spycatcher, like the original Spycatcher.
it really helped. All that absurd
but still,
hysteria.
a lot of pressure though, and I can empathise.
It's a lot of pressure,
especially
death threats.
Yeah,
hate mail.
I really, I didn't know that when we first met, and you go up my estimation because that wouldn't have been easy. And as you said, some of the criticism was reasonably put and painting you as a bit of an idiot, and that kind of hurts.
It was difficult to deal with. I mean, I sort of started my journalism career really as the internet was taking off. I sound like some old man. But, essentially, yes, when I started in 2003, and obviously the internet was around and it was growing in popularity. But the time it came out in 2006, my Israel question, there was a really active, there wasn't even much social media back then. So it was blogs saying horrible things, emails, phone calls. And again, being in Australia, I didn't necessarily think I'm going to get shot dead. We're not living in, thankfully, Mexico or Colombia or somewhere like that. I know that. But it was really unsettling and I found it really hard to deal with. And my then girlfriend was getting hate mail and death threats because of me. I remember going to the police at the time in 2006 because of some of these death threats. And they barely even knew what the internet was. They sort of came over and said, what's been going on? I explained the threats and the response almost like, right, so this is the internet, is it? I'm thinking, fucking hell, you guys are trained well. we're not talking about 1996. Anyway, I wasn't killed, neither was she, thankfully. And I'm not suggesting I thought I was going to be, but it forces you to grow a massively thick skin.
Oh, yeah. Look, I've had threats, and none of them I take that seriously, but it upsets me.
It's in the back of your mind, though, right?
Yeah, I don't like it. Even if they say you deserve to be hung or a traitor, and do you get that via email or call, or how does that normally happen? Oh, I get it online now. Yeah, it's easy to do it. It's fake, addresses.
Of course.
So, some people stupidly do it on LinkedIn, don't realise that then I can shame them. But
I have a thing on my website, which I've done for about 15 years now. If anyone who writes me hate mail, I publish that email plus their email addresses. Fuck you. So you want to abuse me? Fine.
Yeah, no, it's a good
I'm going
idea.
to publish you with your email address.
I'd
look
like
like
to do that too, yeah. Shame them. But yeah, it's confronting. So
definitely.
I've got that in common. And what was your Israel question? Was there a particular question?
I look back at it now, David, the book's message compared to where I am now politically was very mild. I said, I support Israel as a Jewish state. I support a two-state solution. It was very mild. I think my sense was that the perceived threat was that I was critical of the Israel lobby, which I thought then and now had far too much power. I think it has a right to exist, but it bullies politicians and the media. And has been relatively successful for decades in keeping, in many Western countries, a political position, regardless of who's in power, of uncritical pro-Israel support.
That's the key thing, I guess. It's quite mild. I mean, the same with me. I mean, all I'm saying is that, we should...
Not commit war crimes?
Yeah, we should not commit war crimes. As we say, we should. And we should punish people that do. And we shouldn't just make up bullshit stories to get ministers re-elected,
And yet all the wars that we have happened in the last, frankly, ever, would not have happened without an unbelievable amounts of war crimes.
Yeah. Oh, and lies. And we get talked into... And the fact that, the Defence Forces become so politicised now, we couldn't even win a real war because it's all about making the minister look good no matter what happens.
Yes.
And that is not good for winning wars.
But isn't it remarkable, since the Second World War, with a few notable exceptions of minor wars, the West has not won any wars.
No, we don't win them.
Now, I'm not suggesting, therefore, whatever winning actually would mean in, say, Afghanistan or Iraq or Vietnam, but all these wars have been not just lost, but like we've been absolutely thoroughly beaten by mostly insurgent forces who are far less militarily powerful than we are, and yet it seemingly had no impact on us wanting to have more wars.
We haven't, and even from a professional soldier's point of view, we need to change what we're doing. We want to go into war with China. We couldn't beat the Taliban. How's that going to go? It's like, if it's a football team, and this is why, because the concepts are not hard to say, you wouldn't be, if you won the wooden spoon one year, you wouldn't be going into a grand final without a new coach. And yet, that's the way we run wars, and perhaps because it's all political these days, and they don't really care about winning the war. This is what I suspect in Afghanistan. They just cared about winning the domestic elections. So they won the war, and Bush got re-elected, Obama, etc., and they won the war, and they got a lot of donations from the arms people. And no one really cares about Afghanistan anymore. Every time I raise it and say, hang on, we're getting into bed with the Americans who couldn't win in Afghanistan. People like Afghanistan, people have, as you and I have both, the corporate memory is incredibly short.
Everything goes down the memory hole.
Yeah, and no one even remembers. Another thing we've discussed is that if we're arming anyone that says they're anti-Russian or anyone that says they're anti-Syrian, and we're giving them anti-aircraft missiles, exactly as we did in Afghanistan in the 80s, what do you think is going to happen?
Well, blowback. But again, it comes down to the fact, doesn't it, that there is no general political price paid, or for that matter, legal price, in the vast majority of cases, for senior politicians and major contractors and, frankly, the media, who have pushed all these wars. There is none. So therefore, the incentive is to keep on fighting wars, because why stop them? It's a great distraction, and the media loves a good war. And I've often thought over the years that, with some notable exceptions, a lot of journalists love soldiers and love the military because they kind of envy. They envy
the danger and the
absolutely.
Yeah, I know. I noticed that, and they wanted, and you also no one ever got promoted by not dropping more bombs. Look at Petraeus. Just give me 50,000 more men. And 100,000 more men. And they got promoted for something.
But it's not just promoted within the military. They leave the military, in his case, in complete disgrace.
Yeah.
Apart from losing 2 major wars, but apart from that minor detail, is now...
He's on TV.
He's on TV, he's a so-called expert, talking about every fucking war. It's like, I'm sorry. So you're basically... MSNBC is paying you a huge amount of money, or CNN, to speak about wars, and yet you literally lost every single one in the last 20 years. But so look at David Kilcullen. No different. He's an Australian guy, so-called counterinsurgency expert, who was in Iraq and Afghanistan working with Petraeus. He is now has a private business. It's not a secret. I mean, I'm not defaming him. This is actually what he does, giving advice about how people and countries can fight wars.
Well, a man after your own heart, Neil Sheehan, who wrote the Bright Shining Lie about Vietnam, where they pushed the same thing. And inside every Vietnamese is an American waiting to get out, and if only we, give them enough cans of Coke, and they will come over.
Yes.
And they knew it was a lie then.
Yeah.
And she had exposed it, and he won a Pulitzer for it, but we're doing the same sort of thing. The same thing in Afghanistan. We throw enough money. I could see that wasn't going to work, and these people couldn't be bought. A lot of them, and that was actually something that the elites could be bought,
which is the government, of course, that collapsed in a matter of days in August last year.
Yeah. And that was just never going to work. The idea, if we just throw money at them, they'll want to be like us. We actually created in Afghanistan the worst imitation of ourselves, that nobody did anything except for money. Everything was about getting ahead, getting a promotion. There was no real services. There was no caring for the Afghan people. There was no long-term plan. It was the worst dystopian version of Australia and America.
And where's the journalists who spent 19 years roughly saying that, well, victory's just around the corner, it's the next fighting season, we've really got to tell them now.
I sat there. That was one of the things that we discussed, that I could see the writing on the wall when we were briefing then Prime Minister Gillard and saying, we're making slow, steady progress. We're going to and there were no journalists saying, you said that last year. You said that the year before. You said that in 2005.
Yeah.
And having that, you were going backwards.
Yeah.
And no one. And even now, and even when the whole thing collapsed in a week, no journalists, did a mea culpa.
Well, most of the journalists in the US who were there, they were saying that the US should stay there forever.
Yeah,
in other words,
in
other words, but then the mask comes off. Yeah. Actually, what a lot of journalists want is indefinite occupation, because somehow that will liberate the Afghan people in maybe 50 more. How many years do we need? 50 more years, 100 more years? When's it going to be enough? And ultimately, it never will be.
I know. A lot of questions there. Anyway, one of the reasons I wanted to get you on was your book about the war on drugs, because I see there's a lot of analogies.
Absolutely. With the war on terror.
Yeah. And in fact, one of the things I saw over there, it was very similar in that, as I said, I came to believe Afghanistan was a political war.
Yeah.
In that it was everything we did, whether it was giving medals to people who didn't deserve them or demonising people that didn't deserve to be demonised. It was for a short-term bounce in the polls for the minister. Americans were the same.
Yeah.
Now, I believe the war on drugs is the same, and in the way that the carnage that it's caused in Central America purely started off as Ronald Reagan thought it was a vote winner to say, I'm going to...
Well, Nixon even before him.
Nixon. Well, tell us about that.
Well, I wrote a book called Pills, Powder and Smoke, which came out a few years ago, and essentially the thesis was two things. One, when I started writing about this, I was frustrated with what I saw, particularly in the US, where many states are legalising cannabis, which I support. But a lot of people say, well, the war on drugs is over now. It's on the way out. It's virtually done. It's like, actually, the opposite is happening. Demand for illicit drugs has never been higher. Drug overdose deaths has never been higher. From a range of drugs, whether it's heroin or cocaine or obviously in the US, opioids. I mean, think about this figure on its face. In 2021, at least 110,000 Americans died from a drug overdose. It's just, how is that figure on its own enough to bring down government?
The idea that America is the boss of us, when you look at some of the figures, and one of them is 10 ex-servicemen committing suicide every day. A day, 10 a day. And also the opioid thing.
Absolutely.
The figures of people who are dying are beyond our comprehension.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's just like insane. So I guess I wanted to do two things.
And that's not even including the guns.
No, which is a whole separate clusterfuck right there. But no, I wanted to go around the world, which I did. I went to Honduras and West Africa and a range of other places to look at what the drug war means in the second decade of the 21st century, which essentially is still just as ferocious and violent and led by the US. And because the war on drugs has always been a war on the poor.
Yeah.
And it's a class war.
In the same way that the war on terror is really a war on Muslims. It's not
Absolutely.
Really, and it made me my blood boil when I went to Arlington Cemetery and I saw on people's gravestones they had GWOT on the bloody gravestone. It's like that was a real thing. And I don't know whether they were being ironic, but it was just...
I doubt it.
America
doesn't do irony very well.
I know, and I just thought that's disgusting, this is a bullshit thing and people are putting it on there, as if it was a real war.
I think there was also a sense that I wanted to say to people that the so-called left argument is the war on drugs has been a complete failure. And my response is, but failure for whom?
Yes.
I mean, yes, obviously it's drug use has gone up and drug abuse and etc. But it's made a lot of people a lot of money.
Yeah.
It's allowed the DEA, the main US government fighting the so-called drug war, massively rich, as a war on terror has too for the defence contractors. So I'm not sort of person who says Iraq happened just because of oil. I don't think it was just because of oil. It didn't happen just because of defence contractors, but it was a key factor.
Yeah, you're right. That's a next level thing which I haven't got to yet, but I do, because you don't want to be a conspiracy theorist. You don't want to be, but some of the things I saw in Afghanistan, you couldn't. It was hard not to conclude that they did win in some ways, and the contractors made so much money. I mean, that $6 trillion went somewhere. It went to contractors, and they would charge $100 million for building a road. It would cost only $50 million. They'd pocket 25, and they'd give 25 back to the Republican and Democratic Party, and so everyone was happy, except the Afghans. In fact, I've heard on good authority that they were putting in fake Taliban attacks on the bases in order to keep that money coming
surprised to
in
hear
because it was such big money.
Yeah.
That turns your skin, and of course that's a level above most people are prepared to understand. But you kind of think if we really were losing these wars, the war on drugs, we wouldn't be doing them again. We wouldn't be rushing into the next one.
And think about it. I mean, the US and the West was in Afghanistan for 20 years, and despite all that time, putting aside every other issue, Afghanistan still remains the biggest provider of heroin in the world. Like, I'm sorry.
I found that very scary. And one of the things I found very scary was the DEA went in there, the US DEA, and they started running the war as if it was a drug operation. And they gave, from a military lawyer point of view, they gave permission to just kill anybody involved in the drug trade, which is illegal.
Yeah.
And nobody said, are you sure? You know, a lot of the operations, and the Australians were involved in this too. The counter nexus, they call it, was counter narcotics. We would just kill people who were growing poppy or even involved in packing it up or drug. And we
were mostly poor farmers.
We weren't too conscious about whether or not they were involved or they lived in the next village. Yeah. You know, you were in the area, you were shot dead. And that was wrong. That's illegal.
But that ultimately is what the war on drugs has always been, that the people who are mostly suffering, and not generally the El Chapos, I mean, he's now in a supermax in America, but in general, he was making billions. It's the people generally who are literally growing poppies or literally growing coca in Colombia who are doing it just to make a living, not necessarily wanting to make people high on cocaine.
I'm like you, I'm a news junkie, and again, the figures of the amount of people that got killed in Mexico, and they were all the people at the bottom. Like, they'd find 80 bodies one day, 60 bodies the next day. You know, beyond our comprehension. And that's been cause for American domestic political vote winning.
Yeah, for sure. And there's not really any indication that drug war ending, because ultimately, as I say in the book, apart from going around the world and reporting on the ground what the drug war meant, was to say, without legalizing and regulating all drugs, in my view, I'm not the only one saying this will not end. And what that means doesn't mean therefore that tomorrow we suddenly, have heroin in a supermarket. It means that without regulating the market, you remove the possibility of a black market, which when you decriminalise still exists. And also I think there's just, and to me I wanted to document in the book that in the last 5 years there's actually been a bit of a shift. We are now on the cusp of legally allowing doctors to prescribe psychedelic drugs to people to deal with PTSD, or MDMA for people who have depression. Like this was a fantasy for 50 years, and we are on the cusp. Now, I'm not evangelical about that. I'm not saying it helps everyone, but all the studies show that in fact this could help. Like, we have help a lot of people.
Definitely.
And
I mean, in my father's day, when he was a young doctor, if you were a heroin addict, and a lot of doctors, people were, you were considered a medical problem. You put in a bed and given heroin by doctors,
which happens in Switzerland, by the way, and it's actually working
and
very
so
well.
it's not that impossible. That used to be the case, and it's because if you take away that illegal sort of cachet and everything,
and Portugal is the model of that. Portugal 20 years ago decriminalised every single drug because they had an HIV crisis and they had the worst overdose rate in Europe. 20 years on, drug use and abuse of all drugs has gone down. I'm not saying it's perfect. There's problems and people still abuse drugs and die of drugs, and there's still drug dealers and drug cartels. But in generally, Portugal, with all its faults, is the best model that exists. It's a small country, but it's a model.
It's a bit like Afghanistan. This is one of the things, again, because I come from it essentially as a soldier. What frustrated me, because the truth wasn't coming out, if what we're doing isn't working, you need to go back to the drawing board and rethink it. And if we keep covering up and we keep saying we're winning the war on drugs or the war on whatever it is, and we're going to keep making the same mistakes, and the matters are only going to get worse, and we actually are going to destroy the world.
Well, I kind of wonder in a way if, as you and I both talked about before, that there is so much incentive to keep the war on drugs and terror going indefinitely.
Well,
now,
that's why
forever, but
that was the original theme of these interviews, was to talk to people like yourself, because you are an independent voice. You have been from the beginning. And funnily enough, I like the old idea of what you want to be. You want to be a scientist. And the thing about being a scientist, though, is you look at the facts.
Yes.
And you make findings on the facts.
Yeah.
And I think that's essentially what you are. Your position on Israel, you were not Palestinian. You didn't grow up hating Israel.
No.
But you looked
the opposite. I was told the opposite. In fact, I had to love Israel because I was Jewish.
But you looked at the facts, and the facts didn't fit the didn't fit the narrative. And the same with the war on drugs. And we need people like you, not bent one way or the other, but just prepared to. And that was my position. I was from the South. I like the army. I believe we need armies. I'm not a pacifist. But we need honest armies. And it took me a long time before I suddenly think, hang on, what is actually going on doesn't fit the narrative. So we're similar that way.
Is an honest army even possible, though?
Well, I know. That's the next level. You said to me once, was it ever going to work in Afghanistan? And again, my first reaction was, yeah, it could have worked. And then, I don't know. That's a question. I'm not sure whether it really will. But at the moment, because my position is such, is relatively middle of the road, I'm sticking to the idea that it could have. But certainly we could have done better than what we did. Now, let's talk about your latest book, which is not out yet.
It's out next year. It's called The Palestine Laboratory.
Yeah.
Essentially, what it shows is that Israel's occupation of Palestine is now permanent. It's been going 50 plus years. And what Israel has done is, through amazing amounts of surveillance, technology, and various other tools, they have found a way, so they think, with a lot of success, in controlling millions of Palestinians under occupation. I mean, the Palestinian cause is sadly not as potent as it once was. But what the book is looking at is how increasingly that model of repression is an export. It's one of Israel's biggest export businesses. So we talk a lot in the West in the last 5 years about the fear of what China's doing internally. And I'm very opposed to that as well. And the worry, which is correct, that they are also increasingly exporting that model of repression around the world. But what I'm saying in the book is, be worried about that for sure, but Israel's been doing it for a long time. And because I think we're in a century now, more and more nations like the idea of ethno-nationalism, whether it's Jewish, Hindu in India, wherever it may be. And Israel's the model. Israel is a model that people say, inverted commas, it's worked. They've got away with it. No one's stopping them. I mean, we're doing this interview right now when Biden is in Israel, essentially. God knows why, because he landed at the airport yesterday and said, I've always been a Zionist and I love Israel. It's like, okay, thanks, Joe. How's that help anyone? God knows. But the book, essentially, I guess, is really written both as an investigation but also as a warning that if we are opposed to increasing authoritarianism and ethno-nationalism, which I fear is where much of the world is going, including, as we speak, the world's biggest so-called democracy, India, which is an increasingly Hindu fundamentalist state, possibly going to commit genocide against Muslims. Australia's loving India. The new Australian government is going to India and saying what a great country they are. We love Modi, apparently. Which country in the last 10 years has become very close to India? Israel. So I'm not saying what's happening in India is because of Israel, but what I'm saying is that there is a growing global alliance of like-minded authoritarians and ethno-nationalists who see both a way to make a shitload of money from weapons and surveillance and phone hacking tools, but also as a way to maintain power. Mm. And so the book is pretty grim, but I'm happy with it. And it's out in the middle of 23.
What happens there is going to happen here soon enough. So the future, you're a bit more of a pessimist than I am.
I am.
We joke about that a lot.
Yeah, I am.
Caleri's had his charges dropped. We don't know whether that was because they wanted to help Caleri or because they wanted to help themselves. A bit like the Catherine Gunn case, where they didn't really want to go ahead with it for their own self-preservation rather than wanting to help Catherine Gunn.
I often think about my pessimism, and let me briefly explain about that. I'm not generally a depressive person, but I'm often very pessimistic because they can exist mutually exclusively.
Yeah, sure.
And obviously I have 2 young kids and I obviously would like their world to be better than mine in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. But a lot of the key issues that I both either write about or think about or observe, climate change, massive weapon industry, authoritarianism, decrease in democracy, growing attacks on the free press around the world. Most of the metrics are not great.
Yeah.
That doesn't therefore mean they can't
Your
change.
scientists coming through again.
They're not great.
No,
Now, it doesn't mean things are... history is not static. It can change. Of course it can. But...
look, I agree with you on that. I mean, and that's... as I said, I used to believe in positive evolution, and I would see things even like the First World War, Second World War, as if you looked at things in a 100-year span, as being positive developments on the world. I think since Vietnam, and I think the last 20 years, it's increasingly hard for me to say we're having positive evolution.
Of course, the counter view to that, which is something that I always have in the back of my mind, it's also a piece in the New York Times this week saying this, is that on many metrics, not least global conflict and poverty and hunger, actually the figures are getting better, not worse. It doesn't mean there's not lots of poverty and violence, of course there is. But in general, on a lot of those metrics in a lot of places around the world, compared to, say, 20, 30 years ago, they're in fact better. So it's very much, I guess, your perspective and where you live in the world. But the issues that I talked about before on attacks on the free press, or my general pessimism about enough of the world taking climate change seriously until, Sydney Harbour is going under, or, oh shit, Manhattan's going under. Fuck, we better do something now. It's a bit late. I feel that without a serious examination of removing, say, massive money from politics, I don't see any indication of that happening.
Yeah.
Regardless of who's in charge here, it's Albanese or Morrison. It doesn't make much of a difference.
We do need big changes, and that's why, as I said, independent voices are important. ICACs are important. I like to think we can snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, but we do need big change if we are going to save the world.
I think also one of the things that we're trying to do is launching Declassified Australia with Peter Cronau, who's a former senior journo at Four Corners, was to say that Australia, as a news investigative website, was to say that Australia, with some exceptions, has a real gap in journalists being critical towards power and Australia's role in the world, rather than blindly following whatever the US is doing. The fact that we are becoming much more of a target for, say, China by increasing intelligence bases and US troops in Darwin. I say that as someone who, I have some concerns about China's authoritarianism. I think anyone who says that that's all benign is blind. I mean, it's concerning. Yeah. I'm not suggesting that I say China's going to invade tomorrow. I don't mean it like that.
But I think it's a quest for relevance. You're right. We desperately want to be relevant in this country. And who doesn't? You travelled overseas. I travelled overseas. And I hope that we can be relevant. The way we can be relevant is rather than just kowtowing to the US and being this sort of, junior bully. Words for it. We could actually do more by having an independent voice.
I agree. And at the moment, even with the new Albanese government, there is literally zero indication of that happening. In terms of foreign affairs, there is definitely differences between Labor and Liberal in Australia on domestic policy. There is, for sure. But when it comes to international affairs, the rhetoric is different. Albanese wears nicer shirts in the Pacific than Morrison, sure. But the policy on most of these issues, with some exceptions, on the big issues that matter, US alliance, China's relationship, the weapons industry, Israel, there ain't no difference.
Yeah, I'm still on trial.
You're still on trial.
Yeah.
And that is not just shameful, but as we've often said, the people who committed to war crimes, they're not on trial.
No. Why would they be on trial?
Exactly. And I like to think that the new government may at least try to prosecute a few people who, killed Afghans, soldiers, but...
Because that has an effect. The Afghans aren't fooled. Domestically, we might think we're doing great, but the rest of the world is not fooled.
No. And the legacy of Iraq and Afghanistan will stay with us rightly for a long time, as it should.
One of the heartbreaking things is when the Afghans... you hear from the Afghans, some of them who came to see my documentary, and they say things like, "We thought better of Australia." And that just breaks your heart. They don't moan or cry, but they just thought, "We thought you were better than that."
And I think you've said, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you often think that when you say things like, "We're better than that," see, I don't think that. Now, I don't mean that therefore Australia was evil. I don't mean it like that. I mean that, I remember years ago when there was, Australia was this height of awfulness towards refugees, someone like Julian Burnside would say things like, "We're better than that." I'd say, but what do you...
Are we?
Are we? I mean, yes, of course. I'm not saying every Australian is awful, and of course not.
It's
but
the ideal of Australia, whether Australia is the reality or the ideal. I like to talk to the ideal.
And I want an ideal as well. I don't mean that I'm always in the muck of pessimism. I don't think that either. But I sort of think, well, at what point when it comes to war will be better? What, Vietnam?
There's no doubt that we let refugees drown and get tortured because it wins votes. You know?
Absolutely. And Labor is no better on that.
Yeah, and but I'd like to, I like to talk to the ideal that is Australia. Certainly, one of the things about my case is a lot of fantastic people have contacted me, everyday Australians, and they've said, here's $20.
And you represent the kind of Australia that I would like to think is much more possible, an Australia that does value honesty, decency, being against killing Afghans or anyone really. And I think the level of support shown to you is heartening and inspiring. Obviously, the fact that your case is still ongoing is
well. That's why, in some ways,
concerning.
I want the trial, because I don't want to allow them to slink away to the bushes and come back again. Like in any good horror movie, you want it needs to be decided one way or other. Do we allow the government to cover up crimes, or do we not? And we need to find out.
Inshallah.
Thank you very much for coming in. I think we've covered a lot in a very quick fashion. And thank you for your time.
Pleasure. It's been great. Thank you.